The Galactic Academy's outpost on Zoraxis 4 stood as a testament to interstellar cooperation, a sleek metallic structure nestled between jagged rock formations under a perpetually violet sky. It was considered one of the most challenging training grounds in the known universe, a place where only the best cadets from across the galaxy were sent to prove themselves. Among them was Grace Lawson, the only human in her class. Grace stood by the viewport, gazing at the swirling lavender clouds above the station. The artificial gravity hummed beneath her feet, a constant reminder of the technological marvels that kept them alive on this inhospitable moon. She'd been at the academy for 6 months now, and still the alien cadets looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Humans were relatively new to the galactic community, their technology considered primitive compared to the advanced systems developed by species who had been traversing the stars for millennia. "Still daydreaming about your mud planet, Earthling?" The voice came from behind her, sharp and slightly modulated through translation tech. Grace didn't need to turn around to know it was Rizik, a Viridian cadet, whose 6 limbs and reflective exoskeleton made him one of the most physically imposing students at the academy. What he possessed in physical prowess, he lacked in subtlety. Earth has some of the most diverse ecosystems in the quadrant. "Actually," Grace replied, keeping her tone even, "and it's where I learned most of what's keeping me at the top of our survival training class." Jake's mandibles clicked in what she had come to recognize as laughter. "Primitive survival skills won't help you here. This is a place of advanced technology. Your kind is still catching up." Grace bit back a retort. There was no point engaging with Rizik when he was in one of these moods. Instead, she collected her datapad and headed toward the lab for their afternoon session. Commander Exelvar, their instructor, was notoriously punctual and had little patience for tardiness. The laboratory was a marvel of engineering, sleek white surfaces with embedded holographic displays and automated systems that responded to the slightest gesture. It was where the cadets learned about the delicate balance of artificial environments, crucial knowledge for anyone serving on spaceships or outposts. Grace slipped into her usual spot toward the back of the room. Around her, 23 alien cadets of varying species took their positions. Some had multiple appendages, others breathed through specialized apparatus, and a few communicated through color changes in their skin. Despite their physical differences, they were united in their disdain for what they perceived as primitive human technology. Commander Exalvar entered the room, his 4 arms carrying various instruments, with skin the color of burnished copper, and eyes that seemed to reflect the stars themselves. He commanded immediate respect. He was from a species known as the Lyriani, renowned for their logical thinking and engineering expertise. "Today," he announced, in a voice that resonated through the chamber, "we will be studying atmospheric composition and emergency protocols for oxygen deprivation scenarios." Grace straightened in her seat. This was something she knew about. Despite Earth's relatively basic technology compared to other worlds, humans had been managing artificial environments in space for centuries. In the event of oxygen system failures, Exalvar continued, "your primary protocol is to activate emergency reservoirs. But what if those fail as well?" "What then?" "Cadets." Silence filled the room. Grace raised her hand. "The human wishes to speak?" Exalvar noted with a hint of surprise. "Proceed, Cadet Lawson." "On Earth, we've developed several backup systems, including algae-based oxygen generation," Grace said. "Single-celled organisms, like certain species of algae, can produce oxygen through photosynthesis, converting carbon dioxide and light into breathable air." Soft murmurs and clicks of derision spread through the class. Rizik's laughter was the loudest. "An interesting historical footnote," Exalvar said, his tone dismissive. "However, modern facilities like this station use quantum field generators that manipulate subatomic particles to create oxygen molecules directly from available elements. Far more efficient than waiting for tiny organisms to produce it for you." More laughter rippled through the room. Grace felt her cheeks flush, but kept her composure. She knew her knowledge wasn't worthless regardless of what the others thought. "Now, Exalvar continued. Let's discuss the station's primary and secondary oxygen systems. As the lesson progressed, Grace noticed something through the viewport, a distant disturbance in the perpetual storm that surrounded Zoraxis 4. Flashes of energy, more intense than usual, illuminated the horizon. She made a note of it but remained focused on the lesson. Later that evening, as Grace was studying in her quarters, the lights flickered briefly. She looked up from her datapad, a sense of unease creeping through her. The station's power systems weren't supposed to fluctuate. They were designed with redundancies, but redundancies. Her comm unit chimed. All cadets to the central chamber immediately. Commander Exalvar's voice announced an unusual edge of concern, evident even through the electronic transmission. Grace hurried to the central chamber, joining a stream of confused cadets. Inside, Commander Exalvar stood before the main control console, his usually composed features showing signs of stress. "We are experiencing an unexpected energy storm," he announced without preamble. "The intensity is beyond anything recorded on Zoraxis 4. Our primary power systems are being affected." As if to emphasize his point, the lights flickered again, longer this time. Several holographic displays blinked out momentarily before re-establishing themselves. "The station's shield generators are holding, but we are diverting power from non-essential systems to maintain integrity." Exalvar continued. "There is no immediate danger, but I want all cadets to remain in the central areas of the station until the storm passes." Grace raised her hand. "Commander, what about the oxygen systems, if we're reducing power?" "The life support systems are categorized as essential, Cadet Lawson." Exalvar cut her off his tone, suggesting she'd asked an obvious question. "They have their own power reserves and multiple redundancies. We are in no danger of oxygen deprivation." No sooner had he finished speaking than the station gave a violent shudder. The lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness for several seconds before emergency lighting activated, bathing everything in a dim red glow. Warning alarms began to sound, their urgent tones echoing through the chamber. The main display, now operating on backup power, showed multiple system failures cascading through the station. "Primary power grid offline," an automated voice announced. "Secondary grid failing. Tertiary systems engaged." Commander Exalvar moved quickly to the control panel, his four hands working rapidly across the interface. "This shouldn't be happening." He muttered more to himself than to the increasingly agitated cadets. "The storm has created an electromagnetic pulse effect that's disrupting our quantum field stabilizers." Grace understood enough to know that was very bad news. Without stable quantum fields, much of the station's advanced technology would be compromised. "Oxygen generation systems offline," the automated voice continued. "Emergency reserves engaged. Estimated duration at current consumption 4 hours." A collective gasp went through the gathered cadets. 4 hours of oxygen was barely enough time for help to arrive, even if they could get a distress signal out through the storm. "Maintain calm," Commander Exalvar ordered, though his own voice had taken on a strained quality. "We have protocols for this situation. The tertiary systems will re-establish primary functions once the worst of the storm passes." "And if they don't?" asked Rusek, a normally quiet Peltian cadet whose respiratory system was particularly sensitive to oxygen levels. Their pale blue skin had already taken on a grayish tint. "They will," Exalvar insisted. "This facility represents the pinnacle of technological achievement. It's designed to withstand far worse than an energy storm." But Grace wasn't convinced. She'd noticed something on the environmental display that the others seemed to have missed. The oxygen levels were dropping faster than the automated system had calculated. At current rates, they had closer to 3 hours, not 4. As Commander Exalvar organized the cadets into teams to check critical systems, Grace slipped away from her assigned group. She had remembered something from her initial tour of the station months ago, a decommissioned laboratory in the Eastern Wing used by previous researchers studying the local ecosystem. The corridor leading to the old lab was dimly lit emergency power, providing just enough illumination to navigate by. Grace moved quickly, her heart pounding not just from exertion, but from the growing sense of urgency. The oxygen levels were dropping, and she could already feel the subtle signs, a slight lightheadedness, her breathing becoming more deliberate. The door to the abandoned lab was sealed, but the emergency protocols had disengaged the electronic locks. Grace pushed it open manually, wincing at the screech of metal against metal. Inside the lab was a stark contrast to the sleek modern facilities they used for training. This place looked like something from Earth's early space program, utilitarian, functional, with visible mechanical components, rather than the seamlessly integrated technology of the newer sections. And there, against the far wall, stood what she had remembered, a series of large cylindrical tanks filled with murky green liquid, algae cultivation chambers used in earlier experiments but deemed obsolete when the quantum field generators were installed. Grace moved closer, examining the tanks. They were intact but dormant the algae. Inside, still alive but not actively producing oxygen in any significant quantity. The system would need light nutrients and circulation to become effective. She examined the control panel. It was offline like most systems. But unlike the advanced technology elsewhere in the station, this was something she understood: basic hydroponics and biology, the kind of technology humans had been using for centuries. Back in the central chamber, panic was beginning to take hold. The oxygen levels continued to drop, and the tertiary systems weren't recovering as quickly as Commander Exolvar had predicted. "We need to reduce our oxygen consumption," he announced, his voice still commanding, but with an unmistakable undertone of concern. "All non-essential movement should cease. Remain seated, avid, and calm." "Calm." Rizik's voice rose above the murmurs. "The systems are failing. The backup generators aren't working. How can we remain calm when we're about to suffocate?" His outburst triggered others. Soon, multiple cadets were speaking at once, some demanding answers, others suggesting increasingly desperate measures. "Enough," Commander Exolvar's voice cut through the chaos. "This behavior is unworthy of Galactic Academy cadets. We are trained to face crises with discipline and rationality. What's rational about sitting here waiting to die?" Rusek asked, their voice weak. The Peltian was clearly struggling with the thinning atmosphere. Grace re-entered the chamber, moving purposefully toward Commander Exolvar. "Sir, I have a potential solution." Exolvar turned to her, skepticism evident in his expression. "This is not the time for Earth-based theorizing, Cadet Lawson." "It's not theory, sir," Grace insisted. "There's an old algae cultivation system in the abandoned lab. If we can get it running, it could produce enough oxygen to supplement our reserves until the main systems come back online." Rizik gave a harsh laugh. "Primitive plants. That's your solution. We have quantum technology failing, and you want to rely on pond scum. The primitive plants, as you call them, don't depend on the quantum systems." Grace countered, keeping her eyes on Exolvar. "They need light water circulation and nutrients, all things we can provide with minimal power or even manually if necessary." Commander Exolvar seemed to consider this for a moment. The algae systems were decommissioned for a reason, Cadet. They were inefficient and unreliable compared to modern methods. "With respect, sir, right now, they're our only option that doesn't rely on the failing tech," Grace said firmly. "The storm is interfering with the quantum fields, but it won't affect biological processes. Even if we wanted to try this," Exolvar said, "the algae tanks would take too long to produce sufficient oxygen. We'd run out of air before they became effective." "Not if we optimize them," Grace replied. "I've studied these systems extensively. With some modifications, we could increase production significantly. It's at least worth trying, sir. What's the alternative?" A tense silence followed. The environmental display showed oxygen levels continuing to drop, now estimating less than 3 hours remaining. Finally, Exolvar nodded. "Very well, Cadet Lawson. You may proceed with your plan, but I'll be assigning a team to continue working on restoring the primary systems as well." "I'll need help," Grace said. The tanks need to be modified, and we'll need to rig up a circulation and distribution system. Exalvar looked around at the gathered cadets. Rzik, Rausek, and Tella will assist you. Rzik's mandibles clicked in protest. Commander, with respect, I would be more useful working on the primary systems. My expertise is in quantum engineering, not gardening. Your expertise, Exalvar said sharply, is in following orders. Cadet, assist Lawson. Reluctantly, Rzik joined Grace along with Rusek and Tella, a Meridian cadet with specialized knowledge of fluid dynamics. As they made their way to the abandoned lab, Rzik's disdain was palpable. This is a waste of precious oxygen, he muttered. These primitive methods won't save us. Maybe not, Grace acknowledged as they entered the lab. But right now, they're the only methods not affected by the storm. The quantum systems are beautiful and efficient until something disrupts the fields. These algae have been surviving and producing oxygen for billions of years through all kinds of disasters. She moved to the first tank, examining it more closely. The strains in these tanks are chlorella and spirulina, modified for enhanced oxygen production. They're dormant, but still viable. What do you need us to do? Tella asked, her silver-toned skin reflecting the emergency lighting. The tanks need light. The algae can't photosynthesize without it, Grace explained. Rausek, can you check if there are any portable light sources we can use? Tella, we need to get the circulation system working. Without movement, the algae won't get enough CO2 exposure. Rzik, we need nutrients. Look for anything labeled with nitrogen compounds or phosphorus. To her surprise, they all moved to their assigned tasks without further complaint. Perhaps the reality of their situation was finally sinking in. This wasn't a training exercise or a theoretical problem. Their lives literally depended on finding a solution. Grace focused on the control systems, trying to get a sense of what was still operational. The main power was out, but the tanks had a separate control unit that might be switched to emergency power. I found some emergency illumination panels, Rusek called, returning with several flat rectangular devices. They're designed for exterior repairs, but should provide the right spectrum. Perfect, Grace said, taking one and examining it. Let's position them around each tank. As they worked, Grace could feel the air becoming thinner. Her movements were more deliberate now, her breathing more conscious. The others were showing signs of oxygen deprivation too. Rzik's normally fluid movements were becoming jerky, and Rausek's skin had taken on an alarming gray pallor. Here, Rzik said, returning with several containers. I found these in a storage locker. The labels indicate they contain mineral supplements for the algae. Grace took them quickly, checking the compositions. These will work. We need to introduce them gradually, though too much at once could shock the system. Tella had managed to partially activate the circulation system, routing emergency power to the most crucial components. This will move the water, but not as efficiently as the original design, she reported. It'll have to do, Grace said, moving to connect the light panels. Now we need to set up a distribution system. Once the algae start producing oxygen, we need a way to get it to the central chamber. For the next hour, they worked frantically, rigging up a makeshift system that would harvest the oxygen from above the water surface and direct it through the station's ventilation ducts. It was crude compared to the advanced systems they were used to, but Grace was confident it would work. Finally, everything was in place. The tanks were illuminated. The circulation system was moving the water, and the nutrients had been added. Now came the hardest part, waiting. How long before we know if this is working? Rzzik asked, his earlier disdain tempered somewhat by the shared work and growing desperation. The algae should respond quickly to the light and nutrients, Grace explained. They're already alive, just dormant. But it will take time for them to produce enough oxygen to make a difference. I'd estimate at least an hour before we see measurable results. We might not have an hour, Rusek said weakly. The Peltian was clearly struggling. Their respiratory system more severely affected by the thinning oxygen than the others. We should get back to the central chamber, Grace decided. Conserve our energy and oxygen. We've done everything we can here for now. They made their way back slowly, all of them now feeling the effects of oxygen deprivation. In the central chamber, the situation had deteriorated. Several cadets were sitting with their heads between their knees, others were lying down, and the general atmosphere was one of resigned despair. Commander Exolvar was still at the control panel, his movements increasingly labored. He looked up as Grace and her team entered. "Report Cadet Lawson." "The Algae system is activated, sir," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite her spinning head. "We've set up distribution through the ventilation system. If it works as expected, we should see oxygen levels beginning to rise within the hour." Exolvar nodded, but his expression remained grave. "The primary systems are still offline. The storm is showing no signs of abating, and our distress signal cannot penetrate the electromagnetic interference." "Then we wait?" Grace said, sinking into a seat. "The algae are our best chance now." The next hour was the longest of Grace's life. The chamber was quiet save for the sound of labored breathing and occasional murmurs. The environmental display showed oxygen levels approaching critical thresholds. Several cadets had already lost consciousness, their species less resistant to oxygen deprivation than others. Rusek had collapsed, their breathing shallow and rapid. Grace moved to their side, checking their pulse. It was weak, but present. "Stay with us, Rausek," she urged. "The oxygen will come. You just need to hold on." Across the room, Urzik was still conscious, but clearly struggling. His mandibles moved slowly, as if each click required enormous effort. "Your plants," he managed to say when he noticed Grace looking at him, "are taking their time." Despite everything, Grace found herself smiling. "Nature doesn't respond to impatience, Rizik, but it is reliable." As if in response to her words, a soft chime sounded from the environmental display. Grace looked up to see the oxygen level indicator had stopped its descent and was now showing a very slight increase. "Commander," she called, her voice cracking from the effort. "It's working? The levels are rising." Exolvar moved to the display, his movements sluggish. "So they are," he confirmed, a note of surprise in his voice. "Marginal but increasing." Over the next half hour, the oxygen levels continued to rise slowly but steadily. It wasn't enough to bring the station back to normal levels, but it halted the decline and began to reverse it. Cadets who had lost consciousness started to stir, and those who were still awake began to breathe more easily. Grace felt a surge of relief as color returned to Rausek's face. The Peltian's eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition. "We're still alive," they observed hoarsely. "Thanks to some primitive Earth technology," Rizik added, approaching them. His movements were still not as fluid as usual, but he was recovering. "I admit, Lawson, I underestimated the usefulness of your biological knowledge." Before Grace could respond, the main lights flickered and then came on, banishing the dim red emergency lighting. Around them, systems began to reactivate, consoles lighting up as power was restored. "Primary power restored," the automated voice announced. "Quantum field stabilizers online. Oxygen generation systems initializing." A cheer went up from the cadets, strength returning with the oxygen and the promise of safety. Commander Exolvar moved to the center of the chamber, his composure fully restored now that the crisis was passing. "It seems the worst of the storm has passed," he announced. "The quantum fields are stabilizing, and all primary systems should be fully operational within the hour." Grace felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Rizik standing beside her. "Your algae bought us the time we needed," he said, an unfamiliar note of respect in his voice. "Without them, many of us would not have survived long enough to see the systems restored." "They're not actually my algae," Grace replied with a tired smile. "They've been producing oxygen for billions of years. I just helped them do what they do naturally." Perhaps Rizik acknowledged, "But it took your knowledge to harness that natural process. It seems there is value in understanding multiple approaches to survival, not just the most advanced ones." Commander Exolvar approached them, his expression thoughtful. Cadet Lawson, he said formally. Your actions today represent the highest traditions of the Galactic Academy. In focusing on what could be done, rather than lamenting, what couldn't you exemplify the problem-solving mindset we seek to cultivate? Thank you, sir, Grace replied, feeling a swell of pride. But I couldn't have done it without my team. Rizik, Rausek, and Tella were essential. Indeed, Exalver agreed. Which is why I will be recommending all of you for commendations. Additionally, I believe the Academy curriculum would benefit from incorporating some of these primitive but reliable technologies into our emergency protocols. Over the next few days, as the station returned to normal operations and the cadets resumed their training, Grace noticed a subtle shift in how the others treated her. There was a new respect in their eyes, an acknowledgement that perhaps humanity's approach to technology, maintaining connections to older proven methods, rather than discarding them entirely in favor of the new, had merit after all. The abandoned lab was no longer abandoned. Under Commander Exalvar's direction, it was being refitted as a permanent backup system, with improved algae tanks and more efficient distribution mechanisms. Grace had been asked to oversee the project, recognizing her expertise in this field. As she worked in the lab one evening, Rizik entered his movements, once again fluid and confident. The oxygen levels in here are higher than regulation. He noted his sensory appendages twitching. Deliberate. Grace nodded. The algae produce more than we need at current capacity. I'm experimenting with different strains to find the most efficient producers for emergency situations. Zik moved to stand beside her, examining the bubbling green tanks. I've been researching Earth's approach to space exploration, he said casually. Your species has a remarkable history of adapting to challenges with limited resources. We had to, Grace replied. We didn't have quantum fields or faster than light travel. We had to work with what was available to us. A valuable perspective, Rizik admitted. One that saved us when our advanced technology failed. He paused, mandibles working as if he was considering his next words carefully. I owe you an apology, Grace. I judged your species' methods unfairly. Grace looked at him in surprise. It was the first time he had used her first name rather than Lawson or Earthling. Apology accepted, she said. Though, to be fair, human technology is objectively less advanced than much of what's used here. Advanced doesn't always mean better, Rizik replied, gesturing to the algae tanks. These simple organisms proved more reliable in a crisis than our quantum field generators. Perhaps true advancement lies not in discarding the old, but in integrating it with the new. Grace smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the lab's temperature. That sounds suspiciously like wisdom, Rizik. His mandibles clicked in amusement. Don't tell the others. I have a reputation to maintain. As they continued working together, Grace reflected on how close they had come to disaster and how an ancient life form from Earth had saved them when the most advanced technology had failed. There was a lesson there, one that extended beyond emergency protocols and backup systems. A reminder that sometimes the most resilient solutions were also the simplest developed, not in laboratories, but through billions of years of evolution on a small blue planet in an unremarkable solar system. The soft green glow of the algae tanks cast dancing patterns across the lab, a visual reminder of the thin line between survival and catastrophe, and how crossing that line sometimes depended not on having the most advanced technology, but on remembering the most fundamental principles of life itself.